So I will count us down and we will go. In 3, 2, 1. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jeff Frick here, come to you for another episode of Turn the Lens, and it was turning out to be a pretty frequent guest. What's interesting is I've got to interview her a lot of times on other shows, and this is the first time I've actually had her on my show. I think it's like the 4th time I've interviewed her, so I'm really excited to welcome into the magic of the internet. She's Andra Keay, the managing director of Silicon Valley Robots. Andra, great to see you.
So good to be here, Jeff, and you're right. Too many times on other stages. It's really good be here with you.
It took a while, but we finally got it together. So I have a long list of topics, which I always have every time we talk. And I don't know if it was you that said it or somebody said it, that really humanoids are having a moment right now. What is going on the humanoids? You know, they've always kind of been there. They're kind of spacey, and you know, they're kind of the cool things that people dream about and draw cartoons. But what's happening in humanoids that's so special right now that's different than what it's been in the past?
Well, once again, it's taken 20 odd years for humanoids to become an overnight success. But we really needed a certain critical tipping point to reach for humanoids to have this moment. And those of us that have been enthusiastically following companies like Agility Robotics, Aptronic, and some of the 1X, and some of the other companies from Fourier, Unitary, Deep Robotics, we've watched them get commercial trials, and in the case of a couple of them, go from commercial trials to actual commercial contracts. And now that is a significant step. And now that's opened the doors to say there may be a business case for humanoids now that wasn't previously possible. It's possible now. And here's the thing. If you remember what a mobile phone looked like in the I think it was around, I was working in film and television, and I think I got my hands on one of the first ones that was a kind of a mobile car phone in around 1987. And it was...
That's about right. I had the big giant Mitsubishi brick. You could jam it in your car. You could pop out the brick and bring it inside and plug it into the wall.
Now, they never got bigger, heavier, or more expensive. And that's what we need to think about with humanoids today. They are never going to be any worse than the current state of technology. They are going to continue to improve. They're going to get more capable, and they're going to get more affordable. And these are the things that are going to mean it's not just one or two things that humanoid robots can do. They're here to stay, because the range of use cases for them is pretty broad. I think I've come up with about 11, maybe 12 different business models, business use cases for humanoid robots. And part of it is what you might say being labor, but a robot is capable of more than simply, looking like a human and being a human replacement. In some ways, robots are far less capable than humans, but in other ways, they are far more capable. They're capable of doing repeatable precision tasks, and now they're capable of being flexible as well. So there's a range of different activities where we can start to augment. It's about doing something perhaps better, doing something in a way that we weren't able to do before, and about being able to do it affordably. And the big reason that humanoids are very appealing to many people, one, anthropomorphically, we're just predisposed to find things that are like us.
Right.
But we also don't need to create infrastructure and change our world. The primary reason for creating a humanoid robot is that it can use human tools. It can operate in human spaces designed for humans, operate equipment designed for humans, and it's also much easier for humans to train them, whether it's through remote teleoperation, having that direct kinematic mapping to the shape. So this translation, if my hands do this, then that robot's hands do this. If I reach up, it reaches up. And it's really a parallel mapping. And that makes humanoids better in many ways than saying, no, let's create a custom-built purpose robot that could potentially do this job much, much better. And these are the things that, I see as being more of a future thing when we're talking maybe about creating completely lights out operations of something.
Right.
Then we wouldn't need it to be, if we're custom designing the full automation, the full building, the full work flow, then no, we wouldn't need to have it being a humanoid. But there's clearly cases for both. And I think that there's significant demand for both sorts of robotic automation,
Right.
humanoid and non-humanoid. And with such an incredible demand, I predict that there will be 1 million humanoid robots in commercial operation by 2030. And that's simply based on projecting the plans of the top half dozen or so humanoid companies, the ones that are seriously getting traction. And some of the analysts have been looking further down the track to 2035, 2040 and beyond, and seeing an incredible step change. Like it might take us 5+ years, if we count perhaps the last 5 years of development, 10 years to have gotten to 1 million humanoids. It will only take us, in 10 years, we'll probably be at 100 million.
Right. So was it just a combination of kind of classic technology curve effects on the price of hardware, the sophistication of software, the speed of processors, and the connectivity of cloud, just kind of all those things, kind of moving that it's got it to this? Or was there a single event, or was there a Cambrian event, I think you like to use the phrase, that happened that changed kind of the trajectory?
Certainly for robotics technologies in general, there's been a Cambrian explosion event that we started to see in the world from 2010 onwards. It's been building for quite some time, but it's what I call the robotics 2.0. It's about the ability of robots to do real-world, real-time navigation. And you can see that as being navigation like an autonomous mobile robot, sidewalk delivery robot, mobile robot in a factory, or self-driving car. But you can also see it as three-dimensional navigation, like a drone, something in the air or underwater, or a robot arm moving in all directions, but capable of responding, sensing what is actually in space around it, and responding in real time if there's something out of plan. So, for example, if a pedestrian comes in front of the vehicle, if somebody reaches out their arm to stop the robot arm, any of these things that are interrupting the planned action, now a robot can sense it, think about what needs to happen to avoid, to prevent collision, or just to redirect around something.
Right.
Could be as simple as bags of things falling from the shelf.
Right.
But previously, any robot technology was only as good as stop, there's an obstacle. And then you had to wait for some kind of help to reset or restart.
Right.
Now, it's not just about stop and go. It's about go around. It's about make changes in plans in a real world, real time fashion. So that is a fundamental step change in terms of competencies that have opened the door for an incredibly wide range of use cases for robotics technologies. And that's robotics technologies across the board. And what you were asking before that, though, was, is there that same thing for humanoids? Certainly they need the ability to navigate. Arguably, humanoids are doing more complex navigation. The bodies of humanoids have far more actuators, far many points of movement, and they're robots that are moving into social situations in some cases for humanoids. And we're still not really great at working that out. So there's a lot of complexities ahead for humanoids. But the tipping points came on us really quickly. There've been a whole sea of things, Moore's law in terms of computing technology, the same thing having an impact on sensing technology, the same thing happening in terms of just us knowing how to build robots better, so that we can now build a smaller, far better robot, and the role that AI and simulation have played. And so what I see now is it's been exponential growth meeting exponential growth.
Right, right,
And that caused this incredible speed up in competencies. So as robotics has met generative AI or large scale learning and large scale, not just language models, but multimodal models.
right.
And it's very much important for robotics. And that has met simulation. So what we're seeing now, and this goes back to, say, Google Arm Farm in the 2014 period, where a whole room full of robot arms working individually on the same tasks would come up with a whole lot more scenarios than one robot arm. But then those same strategies would be tested in simulation and through AI. And that would multiply the range of options and the ability to find the most successful pathways out of them, which would then be fed back into the real action of the robot arms the next day. So you had this to and fro happening between what the robots were exploring during the day, informing what they were learning and training during the night,
Right.
and then going back into the real world during the day. So you started this incredible flywheel of feedback loops. And we've just multiplied, in a sense, the number of feedback loops and the transitions from simulation to real world, back to simulation, to the real robotics deployments, back to simulation, and so on. So it's compounding. We're seeing incredible exponential growth compound.
Lots of great topics here, lots of great paths of development. So let's just jump in a little bit deeper to the one you just touched on, which is the change in training. And as you've kind of touched on briefly, we dig in, there's two things that I saw, at least at the show. One is kind of LLMs, and not necessarily always large language models, but kind of the robotics version of those for different types of activities, changing the way that these things are trained. And like you said, it's about variability to change and being able to adapt to not exactly follow the script and just say yes or no. And then the other one is this, as you mentioned briefly, kind of this teleoperation piece where you're integrating a human's behavior into the training process to accelerate. So very different way than, kind of a classic factory implementation where you're just mapping out, the point at the end of the laser welder to put a car together. This is a really different way to think about training and opens up both speed and flexibility of the training. Is completely different.
Absolutely. And there's several different ways that training is happening for robotics. And I've been listening with interest to different discussions around, is this the right way? Is this the way that training is going to be happening in the future? And at the moment, I would say the general agreement is that we need all of these methods and quite possibly all of them together. So there's real world teleoperation. Then there's having a person beside the robot doing pose and movement training. There's programming training. There's using English to instruct. There's training from videos. There's training through simulation. And there's training through extracting ideas from a range of other ways that you're mining data around how these things have happened. And it's opening, I think, many people's eyes to the fact that we have limited insights into how humans operate in the world. We've been able to take many great strides with artificial intelligence through text-based learning.
Right.
Even if we count video-based learning, and there's very much a limit to what's on the internet about a whole range of things, like how a particular job happens in a factory, for example. And we're only just starting to see some companies instrument things like production lines to learn exactly how different tasks are done and what's the range between a task being performed successfully or really, really well and being performed not up to scratch, and how we can learn across those things and improve those outcomes. It's a little bit like when robotics went into warehouse, into logistics in factories. There was a lot of feedback that within the United States, up to 75% of factories were not digitized in terms of their inventories and operations. It was kind of moving from an Excel spreadsheet to a printout to somebody recording things on clipboards to transferring them back in. There wasn't a kind of a digitized real-time base of knowledge. And a lot of these things you needed to build in some of these foundational steps before you could go and add more sophisticated automation or autonomous mobile robots, for example.
Right.
There are some instances where the robots are able to step past the lack of previous digitization. But in terms of training, one of the big reasons that I think humanoids are really having a moment is because they're going to be ideal platforms for data collection about doing all of these human type tasks in the world. And they'll be developing this digital library of what is the range of how you do things, and even simple tasks. For example, the number of different door closures that there are in the world is almost infinite. They open outwards, they open inwards, they open sideways, they open dual doors. You push, you turn, you clip, there are so many different ways that we as people can navigate doors.
Right.
That's such a basic thing. And yet collecting enough of that information to have the sort of materials that we need to do successful training. Well, maybe we do need robots out there just exploring and discovering a whole lot of those edge cases that they're still having trouble with.
Right, right. So you've covered ethics a lot in your time. You've spoken on ethics and robotics a lot. And some people might say robots are kind of the embodiment of software, or some people might say these days it's AI with arms and legs. As the robots move from the factory floor out into this world, what are some of the ethical considerations, both historically that have not really changed, but really now are new things now that they've left the confines behind the yellow tape and the glass doors?
That's a really great question. And sometimes I like to say, I'm on the side of Robotopia because I don't want to be on the side of AI apocalypse. I can see a lot of things potentially going wrong in the use of AI. And one of the reasons that it is perhaps what I consider to be more dangerous is because at some levels, it's cheap and easy and invisible. And so we don't see what might be happening under the hood, and therefore we're not paying the attention that we need to pay to it. Whereas robots are inherently more visible, being physical, and they cost more to deploy in the world. We're not going to be spamming the world with robots. And that makes us take more care. So I think that there are inherently some guardrails built into robotics that AI might not have. And yet there is an incredible overlap between the issues. And oftentimes people think of robotics only in terms of physical issues, whereas we're going to see the same financial and emotional issues as well. One of the areas that really got me started in robotics and that I am most passionate about is the impact of the technology on society and on all parts and levels of society. There are ways that we can address these things with, say, ethical or user-centered design. There are other ways. We're talking about democratization of technology, getting it out into more people's hands. But fundamentally, we also need to broadly understand what are the potential issues of this technology moving into society. And we don't need to be too scared because we've dealt with new technologies multiple times as societies. And there are guidebooks for the sorts of ways that we as society deal with major technological shifts. I talk about it very often in terms of, here are my 5 laws of robotics. And they're the antithesis of Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, which many people still look to. They express our needs and desires from robots. We don't want robots that can harm us. or harm anybody else. Those particular rules that Asimov came up with, I always thought they were examples of rules that you could never deploy successfully, because all of his stories were about how they went wrong. But a lot of people still look to them as these are the sorts of rules we need. It reflects on the things that we want, the things that are our priorities, but it doesn't reflect on pragmatically, how would we actually go about doing this, and how is this possible with a robotics technology? So I like to consider myself a techno-pragmatist, not a techno-optimist or a techno-pessimist, but I believe that we're going to be moving forward, technologically speaking. It's almost an imperative, but that doesn't mean that we should do it thoughtlessly. I want to be one of the people that's moving forward, helping to put a brake on when it's needed in the right spots. And I want to share that information and that ability to see where the potential problems are. So my 5 laws for robotics start by sounding like Asimov, because I say robots should not kill. The thing is, this is one of our most fundamental laws, rules, moral principles across society. So we actually have frameworks to help us monitor that or control that. We have laws. If a robot is going to be acting lawfully, then it would not kill people. Physical safety, though, is just the starting point. See, the next thing from that is robots should be designed to be law-abiding. Now, that starts to raise the question of, but whose responsibility is this? Is this the responsibility of the people building the robot, the people operating the robot, or the people around the robot? You know, where is the responsibility sitting? So we need robots to be abiding by laws, and we have a lot of past record of this. For example, where is the liability for an automobile accident? And we've come up with different ways of assigning responsibility based on the circumstances.
Have we modified that for Waymos, though? It's funny you just said that, because I was going to say, you know, if a Waymo gets in an accident as a proxy robot, now you've got who wrote the software, who built the thing. I mean, you got a whole nother layer of complexity on whose responsibility. I'd be curious. I don't know if that's gone to court to kind of have some precedent set, or maybe it does.
In the court cases, one was in an Uber vehicle driving autonomously in Phoenix, and a pedestrian was killed. Now, in this instance, the safety driver who was there as the responsible person was the one that was held accountable. But I think that was largely a victory for the companies with the best paid lawyers versus what would be repeatable case law.
Right. And there's no safety drivers anymore. We've moved past safety drivers.
And this does mean that people in the legal profession, legal scholars, have not been thinking long and hard about this for the last 20 years and really diving into it. Where we're at is that these things haven't happened frequently enough for there to be some more established precedents and understandings.
Go to number 3.
Third law, robots need to be good products, because the same thing happened in a non-fatal accident in San Francisco, and it caused the complete shutdown of Cruise, which was GM's self-driving vehicle play. It killed the company.
Yeah, well, arguably in that case, they weren't ready for prime time, because when the data came out on the number of interventions, they were so far from autonomous. Their intervention rate was like once every 2 miles or something. It was like, you guys aren't ready for prime time, put those things away.
without kind of litigating that one further, because maybe they shouldn't have been able to be testing. And
right.
We should be talking to whoever was certifying that or allowing that. But these things can become kind of Jenga towers. And all I'm saying really is that there is this kind of hierarchy. If you start by saying robots should not harm, should not kill, they should obey the law, then that's talking about where law is one of our major frameworks for dealing with this. And then if we talk about they need to be good products, then we recognize that to be commercially viable, there is a really strong incentive for robotics companies to be incorporating this early. And certainly I see this with the rollout of humanoids. The CEOs of the humanoid robot companies want to see standards. They want to see benchmarks for what is safe. They want to be able to assure deployments and customers that they are as good as is reasonable to expect from this technology, that they're doing everything right. So they want to create these benchmarks so that the industry can move forward and so that they as companies can be successful.
Certainly a dependency, right, for mass commercialization.
Absolutely. And this is where I say my laws, it's about techno-pragmatism, because each of these laws speaks to how and where we should look to be implementing this. But the next two really deal with financial and emotional harm, which we rarely talk about when we talk about robots. And yet to me, they are potentially deeper, darker problems waiting for us if we don't factor that in. And yet it really plays into being good commercial products. Robots should be identifiable. And to me, that means that any mobile robot is like a vehicle. And it needs to have an identification number. It needs to have a registration. And then you can look at what the processes go behind that. And we accept that in other vehicles. If it's out there, then it has to go through certain licensing and registration processes. Now, then you go one beyond that, and it speaks to they should be transparent and they should be truthful. And truthful, not just speaking the truth, but transparent, as in, is this robot speaking to me as an autonomous entity? Is this a remote operator speaking through? Is this a commercial script and it's designed for what particular outcome? If a robot is being nice to me, we are pretty good at starting to assess. Well, we're okay with assessing. If someone's being nice to me, what does that mean? What are they gaining from that? And potentially, how are they trying to exploit me? Is this harmful for me? Now, with robotics, just like with AI, only that's more invisible, there are many levels at which that interaction can be being steered or guided for other purposes. And that can be as simple as saying robots and AI are going to be really good at being salespeople. They might know our particular interests and history, or they might be able to sense and detect our eye gaze and our interest levels, things like pupil dilation, all of those signals of interest that as people we often unconsciously pick up. These things can be picked up by camera technology today. They might also know exactly what to offer as the next step. The advertising industry is really good at coming up with sort of psychological profiles of who are the people that they want to have buying things and how to appeal to them.
I think we need to apply your rule number 5 to, and number 4 actually, to social media. Maybe we wouldn't have some of the problems that we have in social media. But it's funny, I can't help but think, right, one of the big potential markets for the humanoids is senior care and taking care of people in assisted living situations or whatever. And, I could see people with dementia asks, where's Susie? And Susie might be dead. Susie, maybe was an old friend. You can start thinking about what are the different priorities for the robot and the caregivers in that situation in defining the answer to that question, both to be transparent, but also to be careful, safety, appropriate for whatever that medical situation may require, which might not be just bald face, black and white facts.
And I think that there are a lot of parallels in health care and the way that we've developed guardrails in that. So things like informed consent and developing consent plans ahead of time, for example. In some situations, you could see that a medical provider might say it is the better outcome for this particular person, say with dementia, if there is a robot caregiver that can take on whatever character they think it is, and that will keep them far more comfortable. Or there could be a case where there is a strong desire from the person as an individual to say, I never want to be lied to, regardless, and that might then take precedence. And we need to work these sorts of things out. But this is really great because I did the 5 laws, and this is based on some of the best think tanks around this, some of the best work. And I've taken part in a lot of these different activities. Most of them I kept thinking, how on earth are you ever going to apply these ideas or ideals? And I very much like the direction that this 5 laws are in terms of pragmatic ability to be deployed. But I went beyond that and I went, how would I think about that? And I've got 5 things that I think could be answers. One is, we talked about already, the robot registry, licensing. A second one, we've talked about in AI ethics cases, which is algorithmic transparency, having things like model cards, having things where the hidden workings have to be detailed and accessible if people need to look up these things. A third one, taking from health, is to have independent ethical review boards. And maybe it means that you're not looking at something on a case-by-case basis, but you're saying in these circumstances, the best outcome for people is if a robot is allowed to behave like this. Whereas in all of these other circumstances, it's far better if a robot does the opposite.
Right.
So we'll build up these things if we have, I think, independent ethical review boards. Beyond that, I think there could be a very interesting role for the idea of a robot ombudsman to represent concerns that individuals and or groups of society have that they don't have necessarily the ability to voice. They don't necessarily know who to take these concerns to, or may not want to or be scared to. But if you can resort to an ombudsman who can then say, aggregate these concerns and say, okay, maybe as a state or as a company or as a country, this needs to become something that we develop policy or legislation around, because it is having an impact on parts of our society and we're letting their voices be heard. Finally, I think rewarding examples of what good robots are, making it something that's desirable for companies to create. If we have ways of, let's not just punish poor behavior or poor corporate behavior, but let's reward good robots, good robot design, and good applications of this technology.
Those are lofty goals. I hope we do a better job than we've done, again, on social media. And the other one is privacy, where, we've just not been diligent in keeping up with, something as simple as the cookie policies. And, you get GDPR in the EU, where they get a whole bunch of countries that can come to an agreement, but we still fall back on our fundamental states versus national headbanging and can't even get a national disclosure when breach regulation done. So fingers crossed. At least you got a framework, which I like. Getting ready for this, I came across one of your older interviews, and you talked about robots being the AI canary in the coal mine. So what is special about robots and their connection with AI that gives them the potential to give visibility into positives and negatives that maybe, as you said, were kind of hidden behind a screen inside of a computer before?
Exactly. Robots are the physical embodiment of AI. And because they're so visible and because they are capable of physical damage, we have much greater, we take a lot more care with what's happening with robots. And so I think that will allow people to understand what some of the problems with AI might be, where AI is that invisible, potentially toxic gas that might be all around us and we might not be aware of it. And because robots are the physical embodiment of AI, when we see things happening that we don't like, it can inform us as to where these things might also be happening invisibly.
It's really interesting that, we react more viscerally and maybe more aggressively to physical harm than emotional harm. Because you can see it, right? They could put a picture of it on the front of the newspaper if there's a crash, in an autonomous vehicle, where the emotional harm and some of the other problems that can come, again, just pick it on social media, because I like to pick on social media, aren't necessarily as visible, kind of in your face, so maybe they don't get the priority that they should have in terms of addressing them. So a very different situation. You're all over the place in Bay Area, Silicon Valley Robotics. You got a great newsletter. You keep up on a lot of good things. What's happening in the funding world? Has the funding figured out that this is not yesterday's robots, and the opportunity and the technology has progressed to a point where they shouldn't be making a comp to, when they were looking at the little Sony dog or Pepper or some of those early cute iterations of things?
A lot of the investment community has worked out that not only robotics is ready for investment, but also a lot of other deep tech. And what I think is most exciting is in the last 10 years, and this is in spite of there being a whole lot of obstacles in funding in venture at the moment, but we're seeing a completely new class of investor, and that's the engineer, that's the scientist, that's the investor that can have a better appreciation of a complex system that they're investing in. And if you look at the background, experience and educational background of investors that were able to do really well during, I suppose, the rise of social media and the internet and smartphones, many of them were coming from financial or liberal arts backgrounds, as opposed to being engineers. You didn't necessarily need to understand the technology to understand what might be making good business cases. Whereas now I think there's so much of this deep tech, and robotics is a great example of it, because robotics is a complex system, and it really is something that is new as this really complex robotics 2.0. So we need to have investors that are capable of understanding the complex systems. Now, I don't mean that every successful investor in robotics necessarily has a physics degree or has had a background as an engineer, but there's certainly a lot more investment firms that are focusing on these technologies that do have a strong background in those areas. And this is actually more similar to the first wave of venture capital in the semiconductor and early computing days.
The deeper tech, kind of deeper foundational investment. Another thing I want to get your takes, I know you have an opinion on it, is autonomy. And, you said earlier on that one of the big breakthroughs was when, a robot could make a course correction when there was something that was interrupting its standard path. And for me, just in terms of fun, when Skydio introduced the autonomous drone, and we've talked about this before, where I no longer had to actually pilot the drone, but now I'm really instructing the drone as to what I want it to do, whether that's in a program or coordinates or mapping it out, whether it's, inspect a transmission wire or inspect an ugly factory that I don't want to climb all over the silos. But it changed the relationship with the operation of the thing, where now it's you're giving it instructions to fulfill a task as opposed to actually operating. Where do you see autonomy, and how is that going to change things? And then I just to throw it in with Waymo, was that a long time or a short time they've been working on autonomous vehicles? It's like they've been talking about well, guess what? It's here.
It's 30 years.
Is that short or long?
I think it's appropriate for the difficulty that we're facing, and I think it's not a mature tech by any means yet, but it's starting to be. Let's see, it was very, very much kept away from the rest of the world and limited use case scenarios or research only for the last 30 years. Whereas what we're now seeing is we have the early adopters, the early use cases. And I was a little hesitant to put myself into the autonomous taxis around the Bay Area, even knowing that some companies have definitely got, much better track records than other companies. I was still not wanting to be the first person to make that leap, but I've started using them recently,
Yeah.
and I think though that it's an interesting area because whenever there is going to be a problem, and arguably there will be fewer problems than with human drivers, it's just they're going to be different problems.
Oh, they're
And
completely different problems. The problems with human drivers have nothing to do with driving at all. It's distraction. I had a fight with my spouse in the morning. My boss pissed me off, I got a bunch of bills in the mail this morning. I got 3 texts coming in. My kid's having a bad day at school. Those are the things that make human drivers such bad drivers.
we think that we can understand those and or maybe predict if somebody's acting under the influence of something that's going to make them a bad driver. Now, we don't have that insight level into that occurring with an autonomous vehicle. And so I think we've still got to go through that shaking out period where we might find that there is a couple of things that, as experienced users of autonomous technology, if we see this happen, then we go, I'm putting pause. I don't like that happening. We know that that might be an indication that things aren't working perfectly seamlessly. So we haven't yet worked out these kind of codes of conduct, codes of behavior, and codes of reaction to the technologies. I thought you were going to go somewhere else when you said, let's talk about autonomy, because one of the things is we're seeing increasing autonomy, and yet this is just shifting the level. As you talked about, we're no longer giving step by step. We're now expecting, we can say, okay, take me from this point to that point.
Right.
We're reaching a point which is democratizing the technology in the sense that it's no longer something that you need to program or code. It's something where you can make a request, do this, do that. And that's much more like when, for example, someone throws a ball to us, we don't say, okay, now I want to extend my elbow. I want to move my shoulder up 90 degrees. I want to open my fingers, rotate my wrist, etc. We automatically do that. We just needed to say, catch that ball. And I think it's really going to democratize the technologies in the ability for them to be out in the world and being used by a wide range of people. If we can reach a point where English becomes the common operating system.
What a concept.
We're getting a lot closer to that.
Right.
That's one of the things that's been happening pretty rapidly. It's really exciting.
Yeah. So we're getting to the end of our time. I know one of the topics you are very passionate about and speak often about is the demographic trend and where robots play in the reality of kind of some of the demographic trends that we're seeing in terms of just having enough people to do the jobs, period, especially in more developed countries, right? The birth rate is not sustaining or it's heading in the negative direction. So the demand for these, both in terms of great opportunities and all the crappy jobs that traditionally robots have been targeted for, but it's going to go way beyond there in terms of the opportunity for them to fulfill really a real lack of just flat out people and labor.
I'm going to paraphrase a tweet that became viral from an author, and I've forgotten her name, but she said, I don't want AI to do my art and write my stories. I want to do that while AI does the dishes and takes out the trash. We need robots for all of that. Do the dishes, take out the trash. All of those jobs that, particularly factoring in unpaid labor, that so many of us do as parents or with aging parents, all of the caretaking for society as our society is aging. On so many ways, we have a loneliness epidemic, we have aging populations, we have a lack of labor in most all of the dirty, dangerous and dull jobs. People are saying, I would rather do anything else than do that. So across the board, there is no way we can maintain the level of society without developing robots that can take some of the load off us.
Yeah. All right, Andra. Well, we'll give you the last plug. Give a quick little plug for your newsletter and what's going on with Circuit Launch in the Bay Area for our Bay Area folks.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, once a week I put out a newsletter, sometimes even more often, robots and startups on Substack. And those are my two favorite things, especially when it comes together. And that can include things like what are upcoming conferences or events. Not always in the Bay Area, mind. I attend a lot of robotics events around the world, and I like to just bring all the news that interests me about robotics into the weekly newsletter. And I'm very pleased that a lot of my audience are people in robotics, and they say it's just a one thing that they read each week that makes them feel like they're up to speed with what's happening. And Circuit Launch, my favorite place. I'm hoping that we see more circuit launches, not just in the Bay Area, but in Australia, around the world. It's the hardware acceleration, particularly for robotics, but for biotech, hardware, electronics, and IoT. That is an open ecosystem of acceleration. So it's not about giving you money and taking equity. It's about making it really easy and affordable for you to have a full community around you with access to the prototyping and small batch manufacturing equipment that you need, and being in the company of other people building similar technologies. So I am now at Circuit Launch Mountain View most of the time, and Circuit Launch Oakland is, of course, the first circuit launch. And as I said, in 2026, I'm hoping that I get to spend time in some other great circuit launch locations, and I'd love to show you around. And we have lots of events, like we have the Robotics Network event often on the first Wednesday of each month, but we have things like robotics and Gen AI hackathons. We have discussion meeting groups, we have workshops, and we just love to be a place where the community that is into deep tech comes, hangs out, and helps get their deep tech built.
It's a great community. That's how we met. And Andra's newsletter is fantastic. I'll have links in the show notes. And if you're in the Bay Area, check it out. Like she said, there's a lot of events. There's a beer and robots thing, I think, once a month. So it's definitely worth checking out. Well, Andra, I still have pages of notes. We could go for 3 hours, but I think we're going to have to save it for our next get together, which hopefully won't be in the not too distant future.
Yes. Well, let's make sure we have more discussions.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again, Andra.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
She's Andra. I'm Jeff. You're watching Turn the Lens with Jeff Frick. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening on the podcast. Catch you next time. Take care. Okay, super. Thank you.